All right, here we are again.
What do you mean again?
Part whatever, with J. Gresham Machen's Christianity and Liberalism. That's the book we're reviewing this month. We already reviewed it, but
we had a slight technical hiccup, and so now we are doing the review again.
It was a dress rehearsal.
So it should be even better since we had time to practice
very
it.
True.
It's already worse.
So yeah, this month we are reviewing J. Gresham Machen's Christianity and Liberalism. That is a classic book for Reformed people, and I would even say broad evangelical Christians as well. It's about 100 years old at this point. And again, how are you guys doing?
I'm doing
Everybody's
good. Doing even better now.
Ryan?
Yeah, I'm great.
And we are here again with our esteemed guest, Mr. Bob Horton. How are you doing?
I'm doing well and glad to be here.
All right. Well, Bob did a great deal of work in terms of preparing some stuff about Machen's history and who he was. And Bob, you want to set us off with some of that?
Sure. J. Gresham Machen was born in 1881. For most of us, that's a couple centuries ago. But an important man. He went to school, graduated from college at the age of 20, went then on to Princeton to get a theological degree, and then followed that with a year in Germany, studying under many of the important German theologians of the day. Then he came back to the States and very quickly became a man that was recognized as an authority on conservative Christianity, became a leader of those who were standing up for the faith. He became a professor at Princeton, taught New Testament there for a number of years, wrote this book, Christianity and Liberalism, presented it first as a lecture to a group of ruling elders, and then they asked him to create it as a paper, and he wrote something that was published in a magazine, and then turned it into a book. In 1923 it was published. So almost 100 years ago now. This is some 12 years before he is defrocked. He's a member of the PCUSA, which was the conservative Presbyterian denomination dominant in the United States at the time. At one point, they wanted to promote him to the professor of apologetics because Princeton was a denominational seminary. The denomination, the PCUSA, had to approve any appointments to professorships, and they refused to promote him to that position. Shortly after that, they are bringing charges against him because he started his own missionary organization, because he refused to contribute money to support liberals on the mission field, and because of that, he ended up being defrocked. In 1929, he left the seminary, which is before he's defrocked. I get this a little out of order, sorry about that. But he left the seminary to start Westminster Theological Seminary, which remains an active conservative seminary even today. But then shortly after that, he is defrocked by the PCUSA, and he starts a denomination, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church.
Which we are all now a part of.
That's right. Well,
not quite exactly.
Goes on his way to being a member. That's right.
Yeah. So he graduated from Princeton. That's the same Princeton that we have today, Princeton Seminary.
Yes.
Where B.B. Warfield taught.
The
and
same
all those
name,
things.
maybe.
Right.
But yeah,
Not
it's
exactly
crazy
the
to
same.
think that like Princeton started out as a denominational school of a Reformed Presbyterian denomination, right? And now it's, nothing of the kind. So, how the mighty have fallen. But so I think he really sums up the book in the name. I was just thinking about that. Christianity and Liberalism. And, he doesn't say Christianity and liberal Christianity, right?
Right.
He separates them. And in the book, he makes that point, right? That there's Christianity, and then the thing that he's arguing against, he says is not Christianity at all. It's liberalism. And so, we talk about liberal Christians or, stuff like that. But he's saying the error was so grievous that it's not Christianity at all. So he is contrasting them. And I think, the title of the book really brings that out, that, this is not Christianity. It's not liberal Christianity. It's liberalism. It's something else, right? Something other.
Yeah. And Machen was our first podcast review.
Yeah. What is faith?
Right. So when I was reading this book, what struck me is the similarities of this book and that, and especially the chapter titles, which is kind of an odd thing, but they're very simple, straightforward: doctrine, God and man, the Bible, Christ, salvation, the church. There might be one more that I'm missing, but they're very straightforward and things that you wouldn't think that Christians should disagree about. And that's precisely why he finds disagreement with the liberals, who in his day, maybe modernism is more of an applicable term, but he goes systematically through chapter by chapter and shows how in these fundamental Christian doctrines, what are the differences between Christianity and liberalism?
Yeah, and so, I mean, first off, since you mentioned that, if you haven't yet, go listen to our very first podcast, What is Faith? And then acknowledge the fact that we've gotten so much better at this thing over the last few years. But I remember saying the exact same things. One of the things that I've always loved about Machen is that despite being such an intellectual stalwart for the defense of Christianity, he's really writing to the common man in terms of theology. He's writing in such a way that the layperson can understand. It's not something that's difficult. It's not something that you need a seminary degree to understand. I've really always appreciated that about him. But one thing, Bob, that you talked about, him coming from Princeton and then going to Germany, I think that exposure that he had to German higher criticism had to really give him a leg up in terms of dealing with the issues that higher criticism or modernism brought to Christianity, would you say?
Yes, and the higher criticism started in Germany. He went there, he studied under some of the men, and it was infiltrating into the United States, into the seminaries, into Princeton Seminary, and he was aware of what was going on and spoke out against it.
And what would you say higher criticism means?
Higher criticism is primarily trying to deconstruct the Bible, get underneath the sources of the Bible, trying to explain that, well, maybe the miracles didn't happen. Maybe these are things that people are just looking at Jesus and they're attributing things to him that maybe didn't happen, that Paul came along and what Paul writes is starting a new religion that was nothing that Jesus started, that Jesus was a good moral teacher, but deity, well, that's something that people put on him after the fact. They also are trying to say, well, maybe this text isn't any good, that these things didn't belong in the first century. In many different ways, all the things that he talks about in his book that they were criticizing.
Yeah, I think you could probably hear some of these words or phrases being thrown around in America today where it's demythologizing, or you're finding the real historical Jesus.
The historical search for the historical Jesus kind of thing.
And then when you start to peer into that and say, well, okay, what do you mean by that? Who is Jesus to you? And say, okay, well, Christ is a person, and I believe in this person. And then you question that a bit more and prod it, and it's not really reliant on the New Testament. So it's really not reliant on anything besides what you personally feel.
Right.
And that sort of emotionalism, I think, is what Machen's in part against when it comes to liberalism.
Yeah, so he came back to America and started seeing this, like you said, because it took 12 years before he was kicked out, right? So between when he wrote this book and when he was kicked out, so he saw that this was happening, likely, I know there was some famous sermons from, different pastors in the PCUSA particularly that were egregious. And actually, I'm reading another book that coincided with this one and talked about how a lot of big money was behind a lot of these liberal preachers. This kind of a sidebar, but there was a lot of funding going into these big liberal churches in the PCUSA, almost like a plot to subvert the biggest, powerful Christian denomination in the U.S. But he started seeing this like leftward drift or these troubling things, right? And so that's what kind of prompted him to write the book to help the church fight against these errors, to tell people like, no, like, this higher criticism is based on a lie. It's not based on the Bible. It's not based on truth. It ultimately is based on, like you said, man's feelings, man's opinion, and with no basis in any kind of divine revelation or anything like that, right?
And he's seeing this even at Princeton. He will leave the school and start his own, even before he's defrocked. He's seeing that Princeton is not holding to the faith. many of the preachers within the PCUSA, even though the church technically confessed the Westminster Confession, many of the preachers within the church did not. And he's standing up for what's true and fighting against the drift into modernism, liberalism, which he contends, and the whole point of the book, as you point out, is that liberalism, modernism, is not Christianity. It's a totally separate religion.
And that's the primary polemic I think that Machen was after. He's looking to protect the church from within.
Right.
Because enemies from without are never going to conquer the church. It's those from within. And when he starts to see these ministers especially, because that's who he's primarily writing against, ministers who are subscribing to the Westminster Confession in name, but then turning around and preaching against those same principles that they confessed, such as the infallibility of Scripture, the deity of Christ, or the virgin birth. I think you wrote a book on that. That's where his primary focus was, to draw attention. Well, you guys are saying one thing and then doing another here, and we can't have that. So there has to be somebody who goes, it should be you guys, because you're just subscribing to his confession that you don't actually believe.
Yeah, and we have to be careful, because I think, obviously our inclination is to want peace in the church, right? We want peace in our church and our denomination so that we can all turn outward and face the outward threats, because there's plenty of outward threats, right? That there's plenty of struggles people have with sin, individual sins, and the sins of the culture, sins of our society, that can occupy our time. So we don't want to have to do infighting, and so I think the temptation is to say, well, let's just get along, let's just have peace and unity. And it's like, well, you can't, again, if it's a different, fundamentally different religion they're preaching, if it's a different Christ, if it's a different Bible, then you can't have unity on the basis of lies, right? That's not a lasting unity. That's going to blow up into, a million pieces. You can't have that kind of false unity.
Although they would want to point out that let's live this faith, let's live it out. We're doing the things, we're religious, we believe in Jesus. But he points out, you're not believing in the Jesus of the Bible.
Right.
Well, and here's the amazing thing to me. The way that you just framed that is, right now, our society is largely Pelagian, or whatever that Machen was kind of arguing against in his day, right? And so the temptation would be to say, whatever controversies that we have now that are analogous to what Machen had in his day, well, let's set those controversies aside and have a common enemy of modernism or whatever that we're seeing in other societies or other churches, when we still do need to defend our faith from within, even as we're fighting those enemies from without.
Right.
So you can't just drop one battle to, fight grounds of another. You have to be true on all fronts.
Yeah, I think you guys are hitting on a lot of great things. Specifically, Daniel was talking about the Machen talking about the individuals and the life. It's clear to me that one of the central messages that he wanted to get across with this book was that Christianity, it is a life. There is a part of Christianity that is about living, but it's a life that is based on doctrine. That doctrine is logically prior to the life. And that's something that I think he goes to great lengths to show. Jesus Christ was a person. He did live a life, but he lived a life, and the person that he was based upon the doctrine that he taught. He does the same thing with Paul and Jesus. Paul was not somebody who could be put in conflict with Christ. He is the embodiment of what Christ taught in terms of that, along with the other apostles and things like that. And he does a great job of laying all of that out throughout this. He presents Christianity as an intellectual, defensible religion, which, given the fundamentalist movement and things like that, there were a lot of people that did not see it in that frame. They didn't want to push the idea of Christianity being an intellectual faith, but something more subjective and based on experience and feeling. And I think that comes out great in this book. And that's one of the reasons I've, the second time through, I loved it just as much as the first time through.
Well, and one of the good things about Machen is that he's targeted, concise, and he's smart about his apologetic. He takes his opponents' premises and brings them to different conclusions than their opponent, his opponents would want. So, you want to be a red letter Christian, or you want to say that you just believe in Christ? Well, let's actually look at what Christ taught, even though the contemporaries of Paul validated him. And so you can't really dismiss Paul so easily.
Right.
He brings all of this out into focus as he's going through chapter by chapter and looking honestly in a friendly manner towards the modernist, because he's accepting certain things that I would just say, well, why would you even grant that premise? Oh, because that doesn't lead to where they would actually want.
Yeah, I think that's another something that doesn't always get brought out about the way he wrote this book. He's dealing with people in conflict, but he's not doing it in a ad hominem kind of way. He's not doing it in a way that names, so to speak. He's dealing with the substance of their arguments, and he's taking them to their logical conclusions. He's refuting them effectively, but he does it in a way that doesn't come across as bombastic, because, I think he draws the comparison between some of these people being in error and some of these people being legitimate false teachers that have crept in to make people go wayward.
Well, it's not to say he's afraid of giving offense, right? He even says in the very start of the book that too much is made about being scared to give offense, basically, like, call a spade, basically tell the truth, and even if it's offensive. And I think this book would have, he doesn't name names, but I mean, he does call, them unbelievers, basically, who
Let's
are
be
teaching
clear,
these things.
He was defrocked, okay? So it wasn't like he wasn't willing to
but
fight
it took
battles.
12 years, so he was smart in how he fought, obviously. But it took 12 years from when he wrote this book, basically calling people in his own denomination unbelievers for what they believed and taught. It took him 12 years to get rid of him. So, there was a lot of street smarts fighting, political maneuvering, I'm sure, that went on there.
Well, and
but
here's
he
the
wasn't
other
afraid
thing.
of conflict.
Here's the other thing. Whose name is remembered now? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about his
Right.
enemies?
We
Does
talked about
anybody
that.
remember them?
We don't even know exactly who he's speaking about.
I don't know that anybody does.
Right.
I know that a lot of people will look back and say Machen was a Presbyterian stalwart and somebody that we can all look back to as sort of the person who's brought us to where we are in our denomination, right?
Yes. He
Well-
makes very clear in his presentation how these are different. So in each of his chapters, and he has 6 of them, each of his chapters, he points out clearly how Christianity and modernism are different, and he focuses on the key topics.
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, I would recommend the book for that reason. If again, it might not be applicable to your Reformed, it's not applicable to our Reformed denomination as much as it was then, right? And so we can be thankful that it's not, that we're not arguing in our denominational over some of these fundamental issues, right, that he is dealing with in his book. However, a lot of the church at large is arguing with these things, and fighting over these things. And so it's a valuable book for his response to those problems. It's also a valuable book on, just reading through how he handled it, right? How he was just, doggedly biblical and, logical in his arguments. And so seeing how we can confront modernism or liberalism in whatever form it might take, because it's always taking a new form. And, so I think it's valuable for those two things. I would definitely recommend the book for sure.
Ryan?
Same. Machen is a great example of somebody who's willing to defend truth even within his own denomination. And I think that's the example he sets. And also, as Daniel was saying, liberalism or modernism is still prevalent in society, if not churches at large. And so, the idea that Christ is just an example and a guide and not a savior, or that there's no supernatural element, or that we have more of a human nature is good versus we really have sin to deal with and have a sin consciousness to deal with. These are issues that he gets into and is also willing to fight the battle on that front. Yes, within his church and his time, but we should be able to fight, again, 2 battles. Those within the church that we are confronted with in our time, and also those without that God will protect us from providentially as long as we're being faithful within.
Mr. Horton?
I think this is a book that we should read even today. If the media wants to know what's going on in the church, they typically turn to like the PCUSA, even today, to find out what's happening. Or you hear about the Jesus Project, where they're still searching for the historical Jesus. These things are still happening today, and Machen was dealing with that 100 years ago. And this book will help us to understand the difference between true Christianity and things that go by the same name, often use the same terminology, but mean something completely different.
Yep, I concur. I thoroughly recommend this book. This is the second time I've read it through. It won't be the last. I think it has something to offer for both Reformed Christians to Reformed people. This is a part of your history. It's not a far distant history. It's a more recent history, but it's something that you should see how this is how these battles take place. This is how they're fought. To the non-Reformed people, the more broad evangelical types, these are still some of the issues that you might be facing. Specifically, these are doctrinal issues, and Machen outlines a way to deal with them, a way to respond to them. I view this book, because I accept his central thesis that liberalism or modernism is an altogether different religion and a false religion. I view this book as not as a polemical work, but as an apologetical work. So I think that it has a great value and a great merit in that sense, and it's something that should be read and reread by everybody.
Awesome. Well, it was good doing the review for the second time.
Yeah, that was. I think it was as good as the first time.
I don't know. They'll never know. So
We'll let you know one way or the other.
Yep. Make sure to subscribe and to like the video, because we want you to subscribe and like the video.
Like and subscribe for more content.